Hey everybody, welcome back to Elevator Pitch. My name is Joe Ennis, and today I am speaking with Austin Kodra. Austin is the community manager and kind of the head of community for Squared Up, which is a company that creates softwares to better manage IT data for SaaS companies. But in this episode, we don't necessarily focus on that as much as we do about building communities. Austin has done a wonderful job in the past building communities for different businesses and has recently just jumped into this new venture to help Squared Up do the same. So in this episode, Austin brings a ton of information about how he recommends, to build a community for your own business, whether it's, SaaS companies or sales or products or other services online. Austin does a great job of explaining, how to figure out how to build a community and the best way to serve that community. Building a community is about letting people in the community share different information with each other and feel like they are making a difference to the people around them. And I think, the ways that Austin is going about, being a community manager, but also being authentic and humble about his position and understanding that there are people out there that know more than him is really beneficial when it comes to building a community. So I really enjoyed the episode. Austin is an awesome dude and he's doing a great job. And I learned a lot from this episode. So enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome back to Elevator Pitch. My name is Joe Ennis, and today I am speaking with Austin Kodra. Austin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Joe. It's really great to be a part of this.
So, Austin, as people heard in the intro of this podcast, we are actually not necessarily going to be focusing on Squared Up as a company, but specifically your role in kind of community management there and trying to build a community around it. But I wanted to see if you could start off a little bit, just explaining a little bit about what Squared Up does, and then, your role with Squared Up.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good way to set the context here. I am the head of community and content for Squared Up, and I've been doing this kind of work for the last 5 years or so for different tech companies. Just a little bit about Squared Up. It's very niche and might not be like the perfect fit for all of your audience.
Sure.
But Squared Up is essentially a data visualization company that's all about surfacing data that matters to you and your organization and your teams, and then being able to take actions on that data. So we've traditionally, Squared Up's been around for more than 10 years, traditionally focusing in what's called the IT ops space, infrastructure management, sort of the availability of CPUs and servers and sort of on-premise infrastructure, and making sure all that's reliable, up and running, available, so that, engineers can do their magic on top of that infrastructure. Sure. And kind of the reason why I'm coming into the picture now, I started in March, April of this year, is from a long-standing sort of on-premise installed solution. Squared Up's transitioning and making a move into the sort of SaaS space. So software as a service, everything running on the cloud, this sort of truism that every company is now a software company. These sort of digital transformations you hear about on these like different commercials or different blog posts or things you'll see floating around the internet. We're really interested in making all of the data that enterprises produce through the way they build applications, the way they build their digital services, making that data more visible across teams and more actionable across teams. So a lot we could get into how Squared Up's approach is and what sort of unique space they're in. The main sort of teams we're working with are DevOps teams, site reliability engineers, and still some infrastructure as well. So just kind of making sense of all of this enterprise scale data that enterprises are generating and collecting and trying to surface and handle outages when things go wrong, and then be proactive about being more resilient in their applications and services and things like that. So that's what Squared Up does. And within that, I've been brought on as the head of community and content, which, as I mentioned, I've been doing that for about 5 years. I came from the AI machine learning space, was my first foray into tech. We'll get into this, I'm sure, but I come from a non-technical background. So for me, it's always an uphill climb to like learn the language, and learn, how developers talk, what they talk about, all that kind of stuff in these different spaces. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but that's kind of what Squared Up does, and then how I kind of ended up here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think we'll definitely hit on that. My first question that I want to start with, though, is, most of the time we're asking people specifically, what are some of the issues that they see that their company is setting out to solve? But again, we're kind of talking about more generating and building community for different businesses. What are some of the issues that you see other businesses, even, potentially to a degree Squared Up before you started changing everything, hopefully for the better? Yeah, no, I don't 100%. But, what are some of the issues that you see a lot of communities running into when they're not focusing on, or, have any, push towards building a community around either their product, their service, or their niche? What are some of the issues that you see businesses run into? And how are you trying to take a different approach to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I should, the frame of reference is like, there are many different kinds of communities, right? And you mentioned as for a product or service or a niche or an interest, right?
Yeah.
And just as sort of caveat, I've been involved in developer communities specifically.
Okay.
So for SaaS companies. So, you could think of communities as like, building a community around a retail brand, or building a community around gaming is a really popular
one.
one.
I was an affiliate manager for a while. So
yeah, right. Affiliates. We talked about this offline. Yeah. Like when we talked last week. So, there's so many different ways you can build a community, and sort of the two sort of common, you mentioned them, you hit on them exactly, the two sort of frameworks, especially within this software as a service, developer centered marketplace, is communities of product, which is sort of like, get good at using this product and you'll advance in your career, and you'll make your boss proud, and you'll make your wife or husband or significant other happy with the paycheck you bring home and the raise and salary. And by using that product and being a part of that product community, you will accelerate your career, be able to meet your expectations at work better, et cetera, et cetera. Salesforce does this really well. So Salesforce Trailblazers sort of very much built around using Salesforce better to become a better sales professional. That comes with that sort of scale and that adoption across industry, right? Like you kind of need that buy-in from that community to start running that. And then the other bucket is a community of practice. There's also a community of play, which is maybe more aligned with like gaming and some of these other
I'm definitely in hobby-based things.
Yeah, no, me too.
Cool.
I'm on some gaming subreddits.
Oh yeah, 100%. We'll have to talk about that after.
So community of practice. So in the case of Squared Up, right, I mentioned a couple of different personas that we target. So these DevOps engineers, which is all about automating the building and releasing of software into production environments. So basically taking, you're building all your software and you want to push it out, an update to your application or whatever. DevOps is all about the automation of that and sort of facilitation of that process, so things don't break, they're more efficient, teams can build faster, innovate quicker, all this kind of stuff. So a community of practice in that context would be a community around DevOps, and they definitely exist. There are Slack groups, Discord groups, Reddit channels or Reddit subreddits, newsletters that have some social component on Substack and things like this. So more focused on the different tools, the different processes, the different kind of career-based, job-based conversations, really defining and shaping the practice versus like using one particular tool to do a function, right? So there's these two sort of splits. In my world, in the SaaS world, I think there are a couple of areas, to return to your original question, and there are a couple of areas where companies really struggle. One is that I think kind of the first and foremost is there needs to be a genuine purpose behind the community you're building. In a data-driven, quarterly profit, venture-backed world that a lot of SaaS companies live in, it's really hard to justify long-term investments. That's why you see a lot of things around, this quick innovation, but the building of technical debt, where you have to go back and fix a lot of like systems that are kind of put together to move quickly.
Sure.
And I think what happens with community is a lot of times founders, young entrepreneurs see community, there's a lot of chatter now all of a sudden about community-based marketing and how community can drive your growth in an organic fashion with low cost, all this stuff. And I think people jump to that solution before they understand the nature of the problem, which is what genuine community, what can you genuinely provide value around to your community members? I think too many founders and folks who want to start communities think from the value capture perspective, which is what can I get by building this community? What can I bring in the door? How much can we accelerate revenue and adoption of our product, depending on what your goals are, what stage you're at as a company. But I think flipping that script and just believing in this idea of bringing like-minded people together that share a common purpose, that share a common sense of identity, that share common goals and aspirations and pain points and struggles, believing in that as a first principle and believing that you are in a position as a brand that has ostensibly a lot of money that they've raised to sort of build up and support that community versus saying, hey, what can we extract from this community? So understanding from the core that community is about value creation and not as a first principle about value capture. And what I mean there is like traditional marketing is sort of like top-down brand marketing would be like, download this white paper and give us your email address, and then we'll send you a bunch of emails, and we'll retarget you with social ads, and we'll retarget you in this way, or website personalization and all these kinds of things. You want to do that as your brand. Obviously, these are important channels.
Sure.
But I think community gets lumped in with the value capture kind of premise of traditional marketing, whereas it's really about like, you're the brand that's building this cutting edge solution. How can you educate the market? How can you help them work together to solve problems, to define the future of the industry? Things like DevOps, things like site reliability engineering. These things are only really 6-7 years old, a decade max, which in relative terms is really a shift. It's a pretty seismic shift in the way technology is built. So that's the long kind of winded way of saying that I think that's a huge problem is not having a sense of what value you can offer. And this idea, I kind of just believe that to build an effective community, you have to believe in community for the sake of community. That's not to say you don't want to have a plan and a way to actually bring it into your business and to have it make sense, in terms of an investment. But I think you have to have a little bit of that heart and spirit of magic happens when you bring people together and you give them resources and enable them to, be the community that you want to build and not controlling everything. So it's like letting go of control a little bit. I think that's one sort of premise.
That's awesome.
And I think that touches on a few things. And I would say the other thing is that if you look internally at companies, the companies that really do this well have community as a cultural, maybe it's not explicitly like we value community, but a cultural value around spreading that out, right?
Sure.
I've been in situations where I'm the community professional and I'm like the only one interacting with the community, and the founders, the engineers, the product people aren't interacting with the community, and people see that Austin is the guy who runs community. So it needs to be this idea of community as company as community. So really building with a sense of, hey, we welcome all the new people we hire in these very particular ways. We give them ways internally to contribute to the community, whether it's an engineering blog or, guidelines for posting and sharing things on social media, or, that spectrum of ways people can get involved internally. So I think there's that external issue of value capture and value creation, and then sort of embodying community, however you build it, whether you build a new space or you go out and you find the communities that already exist and you contribute to them, or whatever your model is, having that genuineness behind both externally how you present yourself, and then internally how you sort of support community as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's awesome. That was great. And as you were talking about that, one thing that I was just thinking, almost just in line with what you're saying, is a lot of times agency owners, small business owners, entrepreneurs are told we're trying to, our business should be trying to solve a problem You know, what is the problem we see in the world that we're trying to fix? But one thing that I think people forget is, at the same time, just as important of a question is, what community are we trying to help? You know, what community are we either in that we can help solve a problem, you know, within, or, you know, what community are we trying to look to get into that we can help solve problems? Again, to your point that you were saying, you know, how can you better the community? How can you help people? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs can miss the community aspect and just jump straight to, well, I got to figure out a problem. But I think if they can define their community or find a community, they'll, you know, jump to that answer a lot quicker, because they'll know how to find that, you know, answer to what they'll see the problems quicker, I guess.
Right.
And then the other thing I was going to say, in terms of, you know, just businesses that, you know, there's a lot of businesses out there that do a very poor job of interacting with their communities, but I've seen a lot of really, really good ones too. Shout out Sweetfish. I was telling you about them the other day, but like constantly on LinkedIn, I see like a different Sweetfish employee posting something, and then like a bunch of other employees commenting on it, and different people throwing in advice. But it's like I say that to say the businesses that I see that have multiple people within the company believing in the community and wanting to be a part of the community, and not just all giving it to one person, seem to just be so much more easily approachable, I guess, because you just constantly see them everywhere, and they seem to be having a great time, and you want to be a part of it. So I don't know. I think the answers that you gave are really cool, really great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a de-risking that I think a lot of times there's that idea that if you give up control as a founder or as an entrepreneur or as a business, kind of like a key business stakeholder, there's risk in that. And that's true to some extent, but I think the best communities federate this out, whether they do it with their own internal teams and they say, hey, we're giving you the tools and the power and the engagement, the sort of playbooks for engagement, or ways we engage, or we value it and we celebrate it, right? And then also the companies that federate out control of their communities to the actual community themselves and the building of it, right? So I don't know if you know the tool Notion, the product Notion.
Never heard of it.
It's like, it's a really cool product. I really like it a lot for a lot of reasons. It's a very highly customizable wiki, basically, kind of like if you know, Confluence or these sort of internal company wiki sources that allow you to link different things together and create these internal bodies of knowledge. Cool. One of the cool things Notion does around their community is they have playbooks, guides, all these kinds of things for folks who want to open up like local regional chapters, right? So they have programs set up to facilitate the creation of like the, you know, Tennessee region or whatever, I don't know, like, the upper Appalachian region of Notion, right? And and so they have guidelines. They have, here are the logos you can use. Here's the starter kit of tools. Here's the promotion. Here's how we've seen this be successful before. Here are some other ambassadors in the community who you can talk to and learn best practices from. So it really is about relinquishing control a little bit, and that allows you, like you said, to learn more about what are the genuine needs of your end users, what struggles and I think this is very particularly true for developers, like what struggles do they face in sort of convincing their management or their team leads or whatever to kind of do the things the way they want to do. So you don't just get the end buyer's perspective, you actually get the end user's perspective. And to kind of step back a second, I mean, I think with developers particularly, and this is different for every business, right? If it's B2C, if it's like, you just got to figure out what the consumer, the consumer is the purchaser typically, or maybe it's some company that's buying your product for their team or something like that. But if it's B2C, it's maybe a bit simpler, but if it's B2B, there's a difference between the buyer and the user in most of these cases now, because there's so many, the tech stacks are getting so complicated, so mixed up, that the adoption is driven from the bottom up in many of these cases now, where these sort of young, motivated, or folks looking to learn something new, the actual individual contributors are going out and seeking new solutions because they're frustrated with the way their organization is mandating a certain set of tools, or they realize they see a problem and they want to like kind of spearhead change to like advance their career. And developers specifically really, really dislike being marketed to.
Hmm.
They just really dislike, downloading
Sure.
ebooks and getting on
Yeah.
sales calls, and they don't want to talk to someone who's trying to sell them. So community is really this way to become a trusted, to kind of give your, hopefully infuse your brand with, in a genuine way, with some of that authority, where you say, hey, you're really listening, you're humble, you're not saying you have all the answers and you are the end all be all. You're taking that signal from the community and bringing it back into your product discussions, into how you structure events and content, into how you think about servicing those needs. So it's a warmer, more personal approach to figuring out, there's so much content out there. How do you break through the noise? Is really truly is understanding
Sure.
that end user and that end persona. And it's a difficult challenge. It's not a straight line, but I think that's sort of one of the powers of community. And then it's like creating that feedback loop. Like, how do you then deliver the insights from this massive group of people to the right teams? And that's what I think about, is like, how do I build like feedback loops with our product? How do I decide on the content strategy? How do we decide which events and who to target for those, and how to make those community oriented, and all these kinds of challenging things. But I think there is something about like brand authenticity in how you think about community. And if everyone's involved, like you're talking about the Sweetfish, right? If everyone's involved, it's an inviting atmosphere from the jump, and then it's, you can kind of go from there. But I think too many brands like hem and haw over the messaging of every single social post, and when the reality is everybody's just scrolling past that shit anyways. Like,
No one's reading it.
No one's reading it. So it's sort of like, really think about the tone you want and how personal it needs to be, depending on who you're selling to, who your audience is. On a different channel, you might be talking to buyers. So like a CTO, a CIO, whatever, that might be a totally different tone of language. The process is different. But if you're marketing to these like end users who are kind of scrappy, experimental, personal, personable in a certain way, you kind of need to talk on their level and meet them where they are. And I think that's a huge pitfall of a lot of communities, is they more reach to where they think the community should be, and they don't meet the community where they are. And I think that's like that gap in empathy, which is a huge issue.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, this is a good kind of segue into my next, round of questions, which are, what are some of the ways that you've actually, usually we ask, what are the ways that you kind of set yourself apart from other businesses? I guess what I would ask is, what are there any ways you set yourself apart in terms of building that community, and or are there specific ways that you have just found work better? Again, it's probably going to depend on the type of community you're working with. Developers, a lot of people are working with different types of, I was doing affiliates. That's a completely different ball game. But like, in terms of, let's just focus on what developers and working with developers. What are some of the ways that you've seen they respond best? What are some of the ways that you've seen they respond worst? What could you recommend to people who are listening to this, who may be trying to build a community themselves?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things. There's some tactical things, and then there's some mindset things, some attitudinal things, I guess if you could say. I'll start with the attitude and approach perspective. And this has actually been so I've actually hired, in the past, I've built teams of sort of end user practitioners who would be like customer zero or user zero for a product. So building what we would call developer relations or developer evangelism, advocacy, this kind of thing. And that was a really instructive part of my career when I was doing that, because it really forced me to think of like, they're going to be a representative of the persona we're targeting. They're going to be they're the actual user, that kind of thing.
Sure.
And it was interesting my instincts, and I think these were validated, hopefully, but my instincts were to look not for like who could write the best code necessarily, but it was these certain traits. One is empathy, the ability to build that muscle and use it. So
Sure.
Understanding not just the sort of industry level, organizational level pain points, but like, what are these individual developers experiencing? Like, what does their day look like? And really engaging with that. And like I said, meeting folks where they're at. So that actual ability to develop empathy, and not expect people to be where you want them to be, but to meet them where they are. Second is vulnerability. I always look for vulnerability. I would rather people admit when they don't know something. And I think developers would too, right?
Sure. Yeah,
Developers
absolutely.
distrust brands that are end to end in some sort of vague way, or products that promise to do everything under the sun for a problem that is inherently messy, human, human in the loop, can't be automated away. Like there's even as much as we can automate in the tech world, there's still so much human decision making that happens and culture building inside of an organization and things like that to make these tools successful. So vulnerability is another one. Is someone who I present myself as always someone who who always has something to learn. It helps me that I come from a non-technical, non-developer background in some ways. You might think that in some ways that can be a hindrance. In another way, it can be really helpful because I can level set with people and be like,
Right.
hey, you are the expert. I am able to empower the community members with the sense that, hey, they can teach me and my colleagues, on our marketing team or on our community team, you are the expert. And, through the contributions you're making, through joining us on this podcast, through coming and writing a guest blog for our website, through sharing the dashboard or the visualization that you built and doing a little write-up around it. And I'm able to then deliver that to the team with this humility of saying like, hey, we're learning from you as a company. You are going to shape, your participation helps us shape the product that we're building and the future that we're building together. Right. And it's lofty language, but I think if you show that vulnerability and that humility about it, and you don't, you kind of leave your ego at the door. That's one, that is a part of empathy, is to like strip yourself of that ego and that sense of like entitlement. And then two, it is just a signal to an audience that is very skeptical of being sold to, very skeptical of these sales emails that are like, we do everything you ever wanted, and you're just like, you just roll your eyes at it. It's like, all right. I get the function of it. And I'm not knocking, like, good salespeople are really incredible at their jobs. Absolutely. I've seen it firsthand. So I just mean like the sort of bad way that's done,
no,
especially with developers. So empathy and vulnerability are huge. And those are like two of the two kind of character traits I center. And then in terms of tactical things, just to kind of, I think they're connected. One is what I call learning or building in public. So I've been learning all about site reliability engineering, DevOps. I mean, obviously not the coding part of it, but it's just sort of the philosophy, the ethos, the culture around it, what makes it difficult, what makes it messy. And so what I've been doing is just doing a lot of reading, a lot of watching YouTube videos, and then literally just going over to my social channels and just being like, hey, as I'm #learning in public, like, and that sort of authenticity of like, hey, I don't know this and I'm exploring, and then sort of posing a question to the audience and saying like, am I getting this right? Is there anything else I should be reading? People are so much more inclined to engage with that sort of discussion than they are this company X squared up wrote this blog that tells you how to do Y. Obviously there's a place for that within SEO and with discoverability and with high intent searches and things like that. But in terms of building community, that ability to build or learn in public. And so, if you took a developer relations or developer advocate as part of a community team, you'd want them to be experimenting with new tools in the space, or things that relate to your product, or things that your product sits on top of, or whatever it might be, and presenting that as like, hey, join me as I learn about this new tool. Join me as I build and show you what goes on underneath the hood of this like sleek, shiny brand that seems to know everything and have everything figured out. Actually, it's really messy. And I'm like, they've empowered me to go out and sort of show what goes on underneath the hood. So the sort of building and learning in public. And then the second tactical thing I would always think about is broadly a sort of engagement model, but even within that, of how you talk to these communities and how you sort of interact with them. But even a step further is like, what either inside of your product or outside of your product exists for them to contribute, to build network effects around, to build that sense of like momentum around your brand. So in previous work, I've done like community centered or community driven publications. So for my last couple of roles, I actually managed this publication called Heartbeat. It's on Medium, but it was basically a place where AI and data science, machine learning practitioners could come. They could come write technical tutorial blogs for us. We paid them per piece that we published. We ran them. We worked them through an editorial process, so helped them become better writers. Used our brand to amplify what they were working on, and then sort of went from there. So it's really about figuring out the range of contributions from liking a tweet all the way to, joining you in a webinar to dive deep into a case study. You want to build a menu of like contribution opportunities for your community so that when they get there, when they show up and they say, hey, you guys are cool, what can I do? You have a menu of options like, hey, follow us here. We have this contributor program. Oh, we have an ambassador program. Oh, if you're a student, we have this sort of, hackathon we're put together, whatever it is, right? Like the specific program you run should come from the empathy, should come from the vulnerability, and should come from the learning, but you want to have that menu of contributions. So, empathy and vulnerability are the attitude pieces. And then, there's more, but like, I think those are the two core ones that I kind of live by. And then the two sort of tactical things are whatever you can do to sort of learn and build in public, and then a spectrum of contributions for the community so that they can actually get in and be involved and not just passively read things or look at things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think one thing that's really cool about that too is it's hard to fake empathy and vulnerability and humility. And I think, one thing that at least turns me away from a lot of, again, like these emails and sales pitches is, it's super in your face, but it also just feels extremely fake. Like it doesn't feel like anyone's actually trying to get to know you or to help you in a beneficial way. And I think, coming with a sense of empathy and vulnerability and humility is a very, like you said, authentic version of yourself, and it makes you much easier and much more approachable for people. And they're much more willing to respond to you. And like you said, being humble about knowing that you don't know everything and that other people know a lot of stuff and they can help just as much as you can, if not more, in different areas. So I think that's awesome and a great way to go about it. Austin, in closing, 2 questions for you, quicker ones. But number one, how can people get involved in, the kind of communities that you're involved with? Are these open public communities that you're trying to grow? Is this more of an internal team thing? How can people kind of, get involved?
So I think in general, for what I'm doing for Squared Up, we're trying to figure out what that looks like. There's a lot of existing community spaces that we're going to be listening in on. One of the things we're trying to avoid is not like just spamming people with promotional stuff in those channels. So I'm really building, like, I've actually just published this out internally today, a whole wiki page of like, of all the different third-party channels I could find, from podcasts to Slack groups to just to kind of be like, hey, we're moving in this new direction. We're focusing on these new personas. Here's where you need to go learn about them. Like, here's all these different ways you can go do that.
Yeah.
I have like a list of a spreadsheet going. It's sort of informal at this point, but of community prospects, right? So, so for what we're doing, probably not so much. I think like, if you're interested in managing communities, I think maybe this is the way to do this. So if you're interested in managing or building community for your business, or, there's a couple of, I would recommend checking out Notion's approach. One, I would check out what Salesforce does with Salesforce Trailblazers. There's probably a few others I can't think of, but for resources around this, CMX is a good organization. Their community managers experience. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a community for community managers.
Cool.
They do some really cool stuff. The co-founder there built a book called, he wrote a book called The Business of Belonging. David Spinks, that's really good. Jono Bacon, Jono Bacon, he ran community over at GitHub. He does consulting work now, but I believe has written some really good content as well around this. Cool. There are a couple of other organizations that do this work. So I would recommend seeking out because there are like SaaS companies that are like, we'll help you build our community, right? I think those can be places to start, but those groups that like are built for other community builders, I think are a good place to start, because they really anchor you in, some of the difficult challenges of community are like, how do you, most of it's qualitative, right? It's like, I had this great conversation with this guy, he was super excited, but how do you turn that into something that business stakeholders understand? Because like, different business stakeholders are going to have different level of buy-in and understanding of what community is. So how do you turn the qualitative into something quantitative that you can report on every week? How do you build and sustain that buy-in internally to build an internal culture of community? community is company, company is community. Some of these key questions that I think are tactically difficult and like, what is my job as a community manager? It's not always clear. I'm still figuring that out at Squared Up now. All these kinds of key questions and implementation questions. I think these folks at a high level and a sort of an abstraction and a sort of like best practices level, resources like the ones I mentioned are a really good place to start. For that, there's something called the Community Club. There's all these different sort of things you can find, and I'm happy to maybe share some of those with you offline, so you can put them in show notes or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and
not coming to the top of my head.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last question I actually had is, how can people get in touch with you? Plug away anything you want if they want to get in touch with Squared Up and learn more about that. In touch with you, how can they do that?
Cool. Yeah. So for me, you can just find me by first and last name on LinkedIn. That's probably where I'm most active these days, just because that's kind of where the community seems to live for what I'm working on. I'm happy to. One of the things I love doing is I love talking about this stuff. Like, I just love talking about like the challenges and like how people are trying to do this and what models you might use and things like, and some of the struggles, and commiserating over, you're trying to build a community over here and this person doesn't understand why we're investing in this. And so sort of teasing a lot of those things out. So I'm always open. DMs are open there to have a conversation with me. I think that's probably the best way to find me. So first name, last name, I'm highly visible there. Probably wearing the same sweater that I'm wearing on this video feed. That's just my favorite. I just realized looking into the camera, seeing that. And then for what Squared Up is up to, just go to squaredup.io. That's the website of our, and this maybe will change over time, but for now, squaredup.io. That's where all the information about our take on the sort of next gen observability portal for enterprise scale observability is located. There's lots of information there, some product storytelling, blog posts, pricing information. Obviously, it's just a pretty standard website, but we're building that out, and keep an eye on that, because that's where we're headed towards on the Squared Up side. But yeah, for me, just you can find me on the internet somewhere. Just
cool.
LinkedIn's good.
Awesome. And as always, listeners, all of the links to Austin Kodra and Squared Up and some of the resources that he mentioned will be in the description of this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on a podcast platform. Austin, thank you again so much for being here. It was really awesome. Hopefully, we'll continue to see this community, this Squared Up developer community grow and maybe leak into LinkedIn a little bit. We'll see you guys everywhere.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate you having me.
Hey, I want to thank Austin one more time for coming on. It was a great episode. I really enjoyed it. Remember, if you are new here, click that subscribe button. You can actually click the one above my head if you're watching on YouTube. But if you're on Apple or Spotify, do the same. We really enjoyed you being a guest on here, Austin. Thank you again. Everyone have a great week.